Andrew Lewellen joining us here on Regionally Speaking Sports Fridays. Andrew's just written an article, The Future of U.S. Soccer, Part 1, The High School Debate, on grantland.com. Andrew, welcome to Regionally Speaking Sports Fridays.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Sorry we weren't able to get to you a couple minutes earlier, but as you can see, this is kind of how the train rolls. It just kind of goes in different directions. Well, Tommy,
we don't need no stinking track. But
yeah, Tommy's already gritting his teeth, having to talk about soccer, and I told him he's got to deal with it. You know, once in a blue moon, we talk about soccer here on Sports Fridays, and I bet that once in a blue moon, people are probably talking about soccer in general. If it's not the Euro Cup and if it's not the World Cup, people probably aren't talking about it. Is that right?
I mean, I think it depends on who you're talking about. I mean, there's increasing, interest. There has been increasing interest, particularly over the past 20 years since the '94 World Cup in the U.S. and the formation of the MLS. But I will say, a lot of the attention still from American fans is primarily directed towards the European league, particularly the English Premier League, which just had a pretty exciting finale back in May. The MLS is going on. It started. Season starts middle of April and is going on right now. But it doesn't generally get the kind of attention, obviously, that the World Cup or European Championships do. So it depends, as anything, who's talking about it and what they're talking about.
Let me speak through gritted teeth here and ask you about whether or not this is the time that soccer will make the big move, because since the 1970s, we've always heard soccer's going to make the big move. It's going to be one of the top sports in the country, and it never quite gets there. Is this the time that you make the move and it actually crosses the finish line?
Well, why? I'd have to ask why. What do you mean about this time in particular?
Well, because, and it's a fair question, but since the 1970s, when Pele and those guys played for the New York Cosmos, and everybody thought that's going to be the big thing that soccer needs to become a popular sport right up there with baseball, football in this country, and it never quite gets there. Like Tom Maloney mentioned, when you have the World Cup, the Euro Cup, we talk soccer. But when you don't have the big events, we don't talk soccer. Yeah.
I think that's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to it, because in reality, and this is something that I wrote about back in the fall on my blog, Andy's Pitch, in reality, soccer actually has had a strong foothold in the U.S. going back to the early 20th century. The U.S. was actually one of the countries invited to the first World Cup, which is in 1930. I think there were about 14 countries invited then. The World Cup then wasn't quite as competitive as it is now, due to teams literally couldn't always make it, because they weren't flying, they were taking boats and stuff. But the U.S. was invited to the first World Cup, and they actually finished third in the tournament. And then they went to the 34 World Cup. There weren't World Cups from 38 to 50, but they went to the 1950 World Cup in Brazil and actually beat England 1-0, which was still kind of stands as one of the biggest upsets in World Cup history. And like you said, in the 70s, there was NASL, and Pelé came here, and Franz Beckenbauer, and, we kind of got some of the top players after they were sort of in their prime. And what I think is interesting is, so in a way, since the U.S. was invited to the World Cup in the 30s, I mean, it shows that the sport had a presence here. But why is it that even with the NASL, it hasn't sort of maintained a foothold while the bigger American sports became what they are? Because obviously in the middle of the 20th century, the NBA, the NFL weren't the sports that they are now. It wasn't really, particularly with the NFL, until the 60s with the Super Bowl and some of the marketing increasing that it took on the prominence that it has in our culture, really. And so, and as a kid, I mean, I grew up, playing soccer, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, and I agree with you. It's like over the past 20 years, when is soccer gonna make it? When is soccer gonna make it? And I can't say, when is the right time? When is it going to be the time? And honestly, somebody actually wrote to me the other day that he doesn't think a World Cup victory will do it, but I honestly think it's going to take, and maybe that's a bold statement, I think it's going to take the U.S. to win the World Cup to really kind of establish the sport in the U.S. I think the MLS being a league, on par in terms of attention with the other leagues is important. But I think, one of the things, and maybe this is maybe this will be, something that you disagree with. I think soccer, honestly, there's something about it that is almost is sort of an affront to the sort of American sports ego. We're so used to being the best or amongst the best in our major sports, and then you get to the Olympics like track and field and stuff like that, and we're not with soccer. And these other countries are better than us. And I think that it's kind of like, why should we pay attention to sport that other countries do so well, and we don't? And so I really think it's going to take sort of the U.S. becoming the best and winning a World Cup to fully sort of solidify its position. And I think one example of why I feel that way is they take cycling. Cycling, Americans never paid attention to cycling, even though in the 80s, Greg LeMond won a couple Tour de France's. It wasn't until Lance Armstrong started, beating everybody year after year after year, and we saw that American dominance, that Americans really got interested in the sport, and their interest in professional cycling and in the sport, recreationally sort of exploded. So
Andrew Lewellen joining us here on Regionally Speaking Sports Fridays. Andrew, moving on to the article that you wrote on Grantland, talking about the U.S. Soccer's future in terms of high schoolers, and you talk about youth programs, and you talk about in the article kids that aren't necessarily going to school, but they're spending all of their free time, all of their life, essentially playing soccer, hoping to make that next big move, whether it's at the collegiate level, if it's at the professional level, if it's at the professional level here in the United States or someplace in Europe. As I was telling Tommy off the air, this is something that can really sort of be equivocated to other sports as well. Basketball, hockey, baseball, students that are playing sports year-round and never really playing for their own high school team. They're only playing for these club teams, these club options. Go in depth about that. What started this?
I'll try not to go too in depth, but I think what really started is the U.S. Soccer Federation did a report, a very comprehensive report back in 2006 about basically trying to find out why American players were not as good as their international counterparts, and the reasons that they really came up with were that they weren't training enough, and they weren't getting sort of what they're calling meaningful games. So a soccer player in the U.S. would say play like 100 games a year, 90, 100 games, but the number of those that actually were really competitive and were meaningful were not that good. And the coaching wasn't that good. And they're also, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, even the early high school kids in particular, the top high school kids played on 3, 4, 5 teams, even a high school team, club team, and then state and regional teams. And so the U.S. Soccer Federation really wanted to streamline the development process to get kids more training time. So that's really how it started. So the development academy started back in 2007. So it's only 5 years old.